Welcome, Dr. Benjamin Bikman, to the Low Carb Lifestyle Long Weekend. I'm so honoured that you're a part of it. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with so many women and men across the world. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, Tracy. I had such a good time chatting with you last time that when you reached out again, I thought, how could I say no? I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, you're so kind. You're so kind. And just on that, that was such a great chat. And it may not sound like a lot, but there's been like over 6,500 views on my little YouTube channel just of that one chat. So I'm really, I'm stoked about that. And it was
good.
Yeah, full of great information. And I'm actually going to put it below for people who haven't seen it. Please go and check it out because it really covered a lot of great information that people can take away in terms of, how they can look after their health. So you are the author of an awesome book, Why We Get Sick. You are a scientist and professor with an endless fascination of insulin resistance. So I wanted to ask you first, what are you currently learning about?
Yeah, so there's always two things I'm learning. One is I learn what other people have already discovered, what I consider a secondary source of knowledge, where I'm looking through old manuscripts and I'm looking through old textbooks. And then there's the primary knowledge that I'm learning, which is when I'm the one actually making the fundamental discoveries, the privilege of being a scientist. So let's start maybe with the latter. With regards to what we're working on in my lab right now, there are always a handful of projects because some fail and crash and burn miserably, and others bear some wonderful fruit. The one that is bearing the most productive fruit-bearing project in the lab right now is one looking at Alzheimer's disease and the differences in energy use. So we just published a fairly high-profile paper just a few weeks ago, where in fact anyone can find it. I deliberately paid more as the author so that it could be open access. So someone who, if they just do a Google search or a web browser search with Bikman and ketones and probably brain, I wouldn't be surprised if that one comes up. Maybe the word Alzheimer's. But basically what we found, this was from human brain samples of the hippocampus. So this is post-mortem, of course. These were tissue donors. And we measured the levels of gene expression within the hippocampus, which is the memory learning part of the brain. And we measured the expression of genes involved in glucose metabolism and the expression of genes involved in ketone metabolism. And we found that in all the different cell types of that hippocampus, that memory center of the brain, all of the glucose genes were down. They were significantly lower in the Alzheimer's brains compared to the non-Alzheimer's brains. However, the genes involved in ketone metabolism, there were a couple in one of the cell types of the hippocampus, but then all the rest were totally normal. So it's a pretty shocking finding. I was even surprised at the magnitude of this, because typically when you're doing human studies, you often only get modest little differences here and there. It's a small little change from one group to the next. But this was not small. There was nothing subtle about this. So that was a paper we just published. We're following up on that now, looking more and more at how chronically elevated insulin is resulting in insulin resistance of the hippocampus. And my theory, the working theory is that, or the hypothesis is that the hippocampus starts to accumulate this type of fat called ceramides. And anyone who's read my book, I actually refer to ceramides in the book. They are some key mediators or inducers of insulin resistance within cells. But the hippocampus starts to accumulate ceramides, and that is doing two things. It's making the hippocampus insulin resistant, which is lowering its glucose metabolism. And two, the ceramides are disrupting the mitochondria, which of course is the main site of energy production, whether it's glucose or ketones, frankly. So I'm working under the idea that ceramides represent a common soil hypothesis, that it might be explaining these two unhealthy changes that have happened in the hippocampus. So that's my primary work at the moment, with, again, a few other projects that are all fascinating, but that would take too long to talk about, and no one cares that much. But then two, my secondary work is the never-ending pursuit of understanding the fat cell, and in particular, it is appreciating, and in some ways remembering, and in other ways learning anew, the influence of sex hormones on fat storage. That's something that I've been kind of digging through. I don't do that kind of study myself. I don't study sex hormones whatsoever, but I study fat cells, and that is very much something that is influenced by sex hormones. So those are some things I've been learning.
Fantastic. I can't wait to hear what you bring to the world on that stuff, because there's always new stuff coming out, and that's what I love about you. I mean, there's so much I love about you, but you're always so honest with the fact that there's so much we still don't know. There's still so much that we've got to learn. But can we take it back to what we do know? And I think most people watching that have got to this point in the summit will understand that the role of insulin resistance is really, key to our health. Are you able to explain, in quite simple terms, what it is, just in really in basic terms for people to take away and then maybe share with their partner or their mother or, who really doesn't understand insulin resistance, and then, of course, why it is important?
Yes, happy to discuss this. In fact, I just was looking over the lecture that I share with my students on this very topic. So it's something very much on my mind. So defining insulin resistance, first of all, just by way of a little context, but I will get into why it matters. In fact, I'll almost start with that. I'll start with why it matters and then what it is. So it is, I believe, based on the limited evidence that has sought to quantify this, that insulin resistance is the single most common health disorder in the world. It certainly is in the United States, where it affects up to 88% of all adults. I suspect in countries like Australia, it's not as bad, but not too far behind. But there are other countries that are even worse. We know that Mexico is worse. We know that most of the countries throughout the Middle East are significantly worse than the United States when it comes to this. So, and even in some countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, a second home for me and my family, where we lived and worked years ago. This is a global problem, and so that's the prevalence of it. And then the relevance of it is that it will increase the risk of essentially every chronic disease. If we're talking about a chronic disease that is not infectious in nature or autoimmune in nature, then it is almost a certainty that insulin resistance is either directly causing the problem or it's making it worse. And one example of it causing or some problems that it can cause, it's very likely causing Alzheimer's disease, relevant to what I discussed earlier. It is most definitely causing erectile dysfunction in men and polycystic ovary syndrome in women. Those are direct effects. It's directly causing hypertension, the most common form of a heart disease. Well, kind of the early stages of heart disease would maybe be more accurate, and countless other chronic diseases that we're afraid of. And then in instances where insulin resistance isn't causing the problem, it exacerbates it, like, say, breast and prostate cancers, the two most common cancers in women and men, respectively. I'm not at all suggesting insulin resistance caused those mutations that gave rise to these tumor cells, but insulin resistance is most certainly accelerating the growth and is always a risk factor for these cancers. Even when you eliminate all the other traditional risk factors, insulin resistance is still highly significant as a predictive variable in how aggressive the cancer is going to be. So that is why insulin matters. And then now that I've sort of introduced the villain, let's actually get to know it a little better. At its simplest definition, insulin resistance is two things. So it is a coin. This coin that we call insulin resistance has two sides. And one side is the obvious one, which is the one that always lands up. And this is the side that always lands up. And that is that some cells aren't responding to insulin as well as they did before. In other words, some cells of the body have become insulin resistant. They are resisting what insulin is trying to tell them to do. That's the most obvious. Now, importantly, though, even in that one-sided definition of insulin resistance, what we have to also appreciate is that some of the cells of the body respond to insulin as well as they ever did. Not all of the cells are compromised with regards to insulin. Only some of them are. Admittedly, big ones like fat cells and muscle cells, for example, and that makes controlling glucose hard because muscle is the main consumer of glucose. And of course, that ties into outright type 2 diabetes when the glucose is high and the insulin is high. But that's the first definition. That's the most popular, that's the most commonly understood aspect of insulin resistance, the side of the coin that always lands up that everyone sees, and that is that some cells aren't responding to insulin as well as they used to. Now, the other side of this coin that we call insulin resistance is as equally relevant, in fact, if not more, but always overlooked, and that is that blood insulin levels are chronically elevated. We have to understand both of those sides of the coin to truly appreciate how insulin resistance is causing so many health disorders. Because if it was just the insulin resistance, if it was just that insulin wasn't working as well, then we would only have some of these consequences, like maybe the high glucose. But it's the fact that the body is swimming in a sea of insulin that is causing the polycystic ovary syndrome, for example, that is causing the fatty liver disease or the dyslipidemia, the higher triglycerides. So those aspects of what we commonly associate with insulin resistance aren't a consequence of the resistance per se, but rather the chronically elevated insulin. So to sum all of that long-winded explanation up, insulin resistance is two things. One, cells aren't responding to insulin the same way they used to. And two, blood insulin levels are chronically elevated.
And that's something that, as you said, is commonly happening well before people are aware of it, because traditionally we're just testing for glucose, high blood glucose. And of course, that's way gone. That's probably insulin's been high for a very, very long time, as you say. So we've talked in that last chat we had that the importance of getting your insulin levels checked, and there's still so much resistance for doctors to do it, but it's really important to push to have that those checks, particularly if we're showing signs of insulin resistance in our body.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I love that you brought up glucose. Sort of insulin's what I would actually consider the sidekick. It's not the main character in this story. But just to briefly repeat what we discussed before, if we have an individual who's progressing towards type 2 diabetes, and insulin resistance is an early step in that, or what is also referred to as pre-diabetes. What's so important about that progression is that, as you said, we're looking at the glucose all the time. And it could be possible that someone's coming in annually for their visit with the GP, and glucose stays normal every time, yet they're gaining weight, their blood pressure is going up, they may have fertility problems, etc. If they were to shift, not even shift away from glucose entirely, but just shift a little bit, just for a moment, and look at the insulin changes, we would have seen, and what you touched on, glucose is staying normal, but it's taking more and more insulin to keep that glucose normal. So over the decades before the glucose has ever changed, we could have detected multiple level changes in insulin. Insulin could be 3 or 4 times higher than it used to be. We just don't know it. We never measure insulin, so this went unnoticed.
So how do we know where it's going to affect the body? Is it kind of just potluck? Is there some genetic component, or is that just something we really don't know a lot about yet?
Yeah, what a great question. That's not something I've really thought about. So there's no doubt that there are some of these specific insulin resistance related problems that do have a genetic underpinning, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease. We do know that there is additional inputs, like in someone being an ApoE4 genotype or gene carrier, that will certainly predispose them to Alzheimer's. I would still say that the insulin resistance is incredibly relevant. Even then, there are others who may have cholesterol or lipid metabolism problems that the insulin resistance compounds that issue. But if we took out all of those variables and said we have genetically a person who has no predisposition to any chronic disease, they're just the average person who's getting unhealthy because of how they're living their lives. They're gaining weight, they're insulin resistant. I would say it would probably look something like this. The fat cell becomes insulin resistant first. that alone isn't pathogenic. That alone isn't going to cause problems to the person's health. But I still just put it first because I think it's important to note, where does it start, in which tissue? And I strongly, strongly believe it starts in the fat cell. Once the fat cell becomes insulin resistant, then it's really a matter of two other tissues becoming insulin resistant. And then we've started to really accelerate the problem. And that's the liver and the muscle. And I couldn't speak to which one would become insulin resistant next, whether it be muscle or liver. So let's just say they would happen at the same time, because I wouldn't be surprised if it sort of progresses similarly across the two. But I've not seen any evidence to, confirm or reject that idea. But once the liver becomes insulin resistant, it now is starting to release both fats and glucose into the bloodstream. So basically loading the blood with more and more nutrients, loading the blood with fat that it can't really burn well because insulin is chronically elevated. And so if insulin's up, you're not burning fat. And it's loading the body with more and more glucose because as the liver has become insulin resistant, it's breaking down its glycogen to release as glucose, even though insulin's trying to tell it not to. So that would be this kind of two-headed problem with regards to liver insulin resistance. More lipids in the blood and more glucose, which just accelerates the whole problem, of course, because the more glucose is increasing the insulin, which drives more insulin resistance and so on. But then secondly, when the muscle becomes insulin resistant, now we have lost access to the greatest glucose sink in the body. If we are talking about controlling glucose, it really is a matter of the muscle. And I wish I could remember the scientist's name, but he's in a very, very good paper published decades ago. I think it was Ronald Kahn. He said that it is only type 2 diabetes only starts once the muscle has become insulin resistant. And that is because we define type 2 diabetes by a glucose level. And if the muscle has become insulin resistant, its ability to pull in glucose is compromised. And if the muscle can't take in glucose, the body is then swimming in a sea of glucose because nothing will use as much glucose as the muscles will. And then, of course, we start to see the glucose climb, and now we detect the problem as diabetes.
Mm-hmm. So two things I wanted to ask about that. So you believe strongly that it starts in the fat cells. I've heard someone say, is it insulin resistance, or is it the fact that our fat cells just get full and they can't take anymore? So that's the first one to ask you. And then I want to ask you to talk about the fact that, especially when we link it to the fat cells, we know that you don't necessarily have to be overweight to be insulin resistant. So what's going on there too?
Yes. So I say that insulin resistance starts at the fat cells, and it's because they become too full. So briefly, Tracey, I don't know if we spoke about this before, but if we did, then, speed me along, but I'll try to be brief anyway. As someone is gaining weight, and if they're gaining fat, the fat is what we can pinch and jiggle, or that's what's growing. But the actual expansion, the growth of our fat tissue can happen through one of two ways. On one hand, it happens because each individual fat cell is getting bigger. We're not making any more fat cells. It's just that the actual number of fat cells, the size of each individual fat cell is expanding dramatically to the tune of 3 or 4 times the size compared to normal fat cells. Alternatively, a person can be getting fat, and their fat can be growing through a process called hyperplasia. And this is when each individual fat cell only gets modestly bigger. Maybe 1.5 times, or maybe even double the size of a normal fat cell. Still much room to grow, but before it ever grows too big, the fat tissue just pulls in new fat cells and starts making new fat cells. That process of hyperplasia is actually a very healthy way to get fat, but paradoxically, there's almost a limitless potential to get fat. And by healthy, I mean that if you can continue to store fat in fat cells, you will never become insulin resistant. And so back to the hypertrophy idea to help explain that phenomenon. When you have fat cells growing through hypertrophy and insulin and there's sufficient calories to continue to tell them to grow, they will eventually reach a point where they have two problems. One is that if they grow any bigger, they will burst. That, of course, is a very, very unhealthy process that could lead to necrosis and death of tissue. And so this expanded, maximally sized fat cell, this hypertrophic fat cell, starts to tell the hormone insulin, I'm full. I cannot handle any more. If I grow any more, I will burst. And so insulin continues to push fat in, but now this fat cell is starting to leak the fat out at the same rate. And so it's kind of come to this new normal size beyond which it will not grow, because while insulin is trying to prevent it from breaking down its fat, it's become resistant to that process. So insulin normally inhibits lipolysis, or the breakdown of stored fat. And in this hypertrophic, maximally sized fat cell, it's not happening anymore. It has become resistant to that anti-lipolytic effect. And now the fat cell is leaking fat in order to, again, preserve its life, basically, by not bursting. And then second, as each individual fat cell has reached or is reaching its maximum dimensions, it has actually pushed each other. It's pushing the individual fat cells further and further away from capillaries, or the site of blood. And every cell must be close enough to a capillary in order to exchange gases and exchange nutrients and proteins and other molecules. But as it's getting further and further away from the capillaries, it's becoming more and more hypoxic, or it's running out of oxygen. It just can't get enough oxygen anymore. In order to try to solve that problem, the hypertrophic fat cell is now starting to release pro-inflammatory cytokines, these pro-inflammatory proteins, because some of these proteins, while being called pro-inflammatory, actually have this effect of growing new blood vessels. And so this hypertrophic fat cell is doing two things to try to save its own life. It's becoming insulin resistant to make sure it doesn't grow anymore, and it's becoming pro-inflammatory to try to resolve its own hypoxia, or its own distance from blood vessels, to try to stimulate the growth of new blood vessels. But tragically, it doesn't know it, but it's become the villain within the body, because these two processes, leaking fats and leaking pro-inflammatory proteins, while it's saving itself, is now causing insulin resistance throughout the body, because elevated free fatty acids and inflammation are both perfect matches to light this bonfire of causing insulin resistance in the brain and in the muscle and in the liver and all the other tissues that we could discuss when it comes to chronic diseases. So that's touching on that aspect that you had mentioned about the fat cell becoming too full. It's when it becomes too full that it becomes insulin resistant. But that is then very relevant to your second point, which is, why can you see insulin resistance in people that are not obese, that don't appear to have far too much fat on them? And the simplest idea to explain that is that every individual, and this very much plays according to ethnicity as well, but even within every ethnicity, people are different. There's a very much potential to differ, but you do see ethnic differences in this regard, where people have individual fat thresholds. And that is very much a function of how they store fat and how many fat cells they have to store that fat in. So an example I often lean on, it comes from my experience when I did my fellowship in Singapore 10 years ago. An experience that I just loved. But what was so interesting was looking at the insulin resistance and the associated problems in people of Chinese ethnicity. So you have the historical Chinese Singaporeans, and then you have those Northern European Singaporeans, our ancestors, those are, my Scotch-Irish or Scandinavian ancestors, the Northern European. What was interesting is that as you would have these two kind of prototypical men gaining weight, the Chinese ethnicity man would start to suffer the consequences of that weight gain far earlier than, say, the man of Northern European descent. And that is very much a matter of how do you store the fat. And so you can have someone who looks very modestly overweight, or they look like they're normal weight. And if their fat cells are insulin resistant, then they have problems. And the most striking example of this is looking at women with polycystic ovary syndrome. This is the most common infertility, as I mentioned, and it is entirely a problem of insulin and insulin resistance. most women with PCOS will be obviously metabolically unhealthy or less healthy. They will generally be overweight, if not even further. However, there is a small slice of women with PCOS who are normal weight. And yet those women, there was a study that I actually highlight in my book, a study that quantified the degree to which these healthy weight PCOS women had insulin resistance in their fat cells. They found differences. So they looked at two groups, women with PCOS and without, and controlled for body weight. They made sure that they were all normal body weight. And then they had a metric by looking at fasting insulin and fasting free fatty acids, which is a very good metric to determine how the fat cells are doing. And they found that in those normal weight women with PCOS, they had significant evidence and significantly higher levels of fat cell insulin resistance compared to the women of exact same body weight, but with no PCOS. So it's really a matter of how are your fat cells doing. It's not even so much how fat is the person, but how are your fat cells?
I can tell. I know I'm going to have to go back and watch all that again. There was so much in there, and I love it. I love it.
Too much.
I love it.
Too much, Tracey.
No,
you need to give me the kind of throat cut off when I get going.
I would never do that. But I know that that's what I would say to anyone. What Ben's just shared is just amazing. So if you please go back and watch it again and couple it with the knowledge on, the podcast. I mean, I know you've done many podcasts, not just mine, obviously. Wish I could say it was just mine. But
no, let's just say there's only one. Just go to Tracey. It's Tracey or bust here.
Love it. And of course your book. But just sort of following a little bit on that, there's been, I've certainly seen questions floating around babies. And, I just wonder, does a lot of this stuff get laid down, when we are in utero? And then, can babies are they born insulin resistant? What can be going on there, depending on the insulin resistant status of the mother when she's pregnant?
Yeah. So I don't know of any evidence to suggest that a newborn baby can be insulin resistant. In fact, paradoxically, I would say that if there were evidence, I would strongly suspect it would be from babies that were born underweight, actually, or premature babies. Because as we were talking about, if your fat cells are storing fat, then the body's going to be insulin sensitive. And so in that regard, babies that are born premature, they haven't made enough fat. Because it's the baby gets fat in that last trimester. And so like if a mom has preeclampsia and needs to have the baby born early, that's the worry. One, it's that the lungs wouldn't develop. But if you can stimulate lung development by giving the mom some hormones, then the next concern is baby, can we make baby fat enough for normal healthy development? And unfortunately what happens, babies that are born underweight, they typically they have a much higher risk of gaining too much weight and becoming diabetic or insulin resistant later in life, typically into their teens. I mean, it is just shocking. They're born, underweight and below their peers, metabolically or fat with regards to body fat. And then they pass them very quickly, usually around early teens, and then continue to go on, unfortunately. The tragedy also, adding insult to injury, is that when a baby is born without sufficient fat, there is a much greater risk of developmental delays, because babies are supposed to be fat so that they can make lots of ketones in order to fuel their brain. But that's admittedly very much a tangent, but it is a fascinating area of research. So in utero, I would say the most important thing is making sure baby was fat. And the best way to do that, of course, is hopefully the baby can go full term. And then assuming baby goes full term, baby is born. And then over the next 15 years, it's explosive at the front end of it, and then it settles down. But there is this incredible growth of the number of fat cells. Of course, every tissue in the body is making more and more cells. So every tissue is hyperplastic in that neonatal or that newborn period through childhood. Every tissue is hyperplastic, making more and more cells. Fat tissues, no exception. And then what happens with fat tissue, as happens in other tissues, is that at the end of puberty, which is late teens for girls and early 20s for boys. That's the common age. Most people think that it's happening at 15 or 16. Not at all. It can happen in a boy, but typically a boy finishes puberty in his early 20s and a girl late teens. But that is where this fat cell number curve, we've been making more and more and more and more fat cells, and then it starts to plateau. It starts to slow down, and then it stops. We stop making new fat cells once we reach adulthood. And that is, so any growth of the fat tissue beyond that almost always is going to be hypertrophy, which of course everyone already knows is the sick way of getting fat. Some people, a small slice, about 15% of people that are obese have hyperplasia, but mostly it's through hypertrophy, which is why insulin resistance is so common. So with regards to baby being insulin sensitive, it really is a matter of how they grow. And if baby is really born underweight, I would think that actually is more of a concern than overweight. But also if baby is born very much overweight, which can happen if mom has gestational diabetes, where she has her high insulin and her high glucose, that basically just grows this fetus in a state of high glucose and high insulin. And so the baby's literally developing in that metabolic stew. And so it's no surprise that when baby's born, baby carries some of that with him or her after birth. So it's a delicate thing, I know, because there's so much, Tracey, of course, I'm the guy, and I only saw my wife deal with this. My part in fertility was a wonderful, delightful moment each time. But not much physically beyond that for me. The woman carries the metabolic burden of fertility. And I know nowadays that this is a delicate thing because I very much appreciate, I very much believe that, well, a lot of things I guess I could say, not to get political, so I'll keep it, what can I say? I think it is a wonderful blessing and burden on that mom to be. It really is. I think heavens that my wife wanted to be a mother, because I very much wanted to be a father. But it is such it's not easy being a dad, but golly, it's a hell of a lot easier than being the mom, because the mom really has that, not only the emotional aspect that the father plays in her own way, but that very physical metabolic burden that she has to go through for the sake of the child. So having said all of that, and admittedly quite awkwardly, I would just say it is a tremendous responsibility on mommy to be, to just do her best to try to make this, to kind of give the baby every metabolic advantage she can. And I know easier said than done. I would hate for any woman listening to this thinking I'm in any way judging her. Having just seen this in my own family, I can, as the outsider, acknowledge just how challenging all of this can be. And so I don't mean to add any pressure to what may be an already high pressure situation, but in those moments where mom can make a decision on what to eat and what she's craving, I would just say, just pause for just a second. Sometimes, of course, indulge on occasion. Of course, it's your right, by golly. But on occasion, just pause for a moment and just think, I'm eating for more than just me. There is this little human that's going to come out, and it's a piece of me and a piece of this hopefully person I love. So I got to give this little baby the best chance I can. And genetics are what they are. And little babies, as you know as well as I do, these kids just come with their own damn personalities. And we wish we could mold them every way we want, but they just come out the way they come out, much to our chagrin as parents.
I just sorry, I love how you say that, and I don't feel there was any judgment in that at all. I think as a mum myself, and the reason I do what I do is I just want people to know, because I didn't know when I was pregnant with my first 4, and yes, I just ate kind of what I craved, and that might have been Macca's quite a few times, and but if I'd like to say that if I had the knowledge then that I do now, I may have made different choices, and it is what it is. We obviously can't go back to change the past, and we're always doing the best we can. But at least at least have some knowledge. If you've got the knowledge, you can do with it what you want. But my issue is that most women just don't have that knowledge, and that's why I love what you do, and I want to share it as much as possible, just to give people those choices. And it is obviously up to them what they do with it, but if they don't know, they can't have a choice. They don't have a choice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Knowledge is liberating in that regard. And I would say where we have people who are looking and thinking, oh golly, maybe I could have eaten better when I was pregnant. Well, just try to make the changes now. And for those with little kids, I would say it is so much easier to start young. It is so much easier. Try to set the family tone, the culture. When I see children that are very unhealthy and very overweight, if not outright obese, and we see that more and more, that's not the kid's fault. And again, I hate to sound like I'm being judgmental of parents, but maybe in a way, maybe I am a little, but I'm just saying the parents control what comes into the house. So we've got to do our best. It is part of our burden as parents. We got to try to change the culture of the home so that breakfast isn't just cereal and toast and juice. Never drink juice, at the very least. And we try to focus on protein. I know for me as a parent, I just want to focus on protein. As much as I'm a fan of fat, I have no worry my kids are getting fat. Fat just comes up. I want them to get protein, because that's what's deficient in all those snacks that they're going to be getting at school, or even the occasional snack that we have at home. And we certainly do have them. It's the protein that's going to be absent. And so I try to focus on real sources of protein, especially meat, eggs, and dairy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting, isn't it? We can make the changes at any time that we want to. And, my older kids were kind of in their 8, 10, 12, maybe a little bit younger when I first sort of understood this, and they were in shock when I completely changed the diet, which I thought was actually healthy. So, again, we're always doing the best we can. But my younger one, he basically went from breast milk to steak, and his favorite food is steak and salmon. And, it's just so different, and it's so easy, because that's just kind of what he knows. He's never had cereal. He's never had juice. He's never had rice, all the stuff that my other 3 unfortunately had.
I get it.
My little experiment, which I didn't mean to do, but it's just, interesting. But I see that it really, it doesn't matter where you are, but just start, with making some changes. And you touched on it there. One of the questions I definitely had for you is, with all the knowledge that you have, what do you feed your children? And I know you have touched on it, but I think I'm just fascinated, because, you do know so much about what can happen around diet.
Well, what's so funny is that if little lovely Cheryl were standing right here with me, she would be so quick to point out, oh yeah, but we try, but oh gosh, we fail as much as we succeed. And so I need to say that I don't want anyone to think I rage against kind of this lifestyle porn that, where everyone's looking at Instagram and social media and thinking, oh, Ben and Tracey got it all figured out. They're the best parents. They wouldn't know what it's like for me down in the trenches. Yeah, we do. Because as much as I'm painting this rosy picture, it is very often very much a battle. Even if I'm just talking about nothing but nutrition, not talking about getting my kids to practice piano and getting my kids to do their damn homework, it's not at all glorious. But when it comes to food, because actually I love playing the piano. I want my kids to become little musicians as well, frankly, but I also want them to be metabolically healthy. I focus on trying to make sure that at least a few times a week we get meat in some form. And I don't mean chicken. I mean, usually it's going to be beef or fish. I really try to make sure that we have at least 3 or 4 hearty meat-based meals, because I just am utterly convinced that all this talk of superfood, if that's a plant and it's all fake, superfood to me is beef and fish, really. So I want my kids to try to get that in a dinner, and so I'll focus on that. Other than that, low sugar yogurts. You can get different kinds of yogurts that have lower sugar content, and I very much do that. Or we just get plain whole fat Greek yogurt, and we just add our own flavor to it, and then use to some degree we'll use like stevia or monk fruit to just sweeten it a little bit with like a lime flavor or a pineapple flavor, and we blend it up, and then the kids will snack on that. So that's something. And then breakfast is something that I do. That's sort of the way the family works. I do breakfast every morning, and frankly, it's yummy for the kids because I let them indulge a little bit, but I try to make sure that they get whatever the breakfast is. It's several eggs worth of breakfast. So, like for example, I will sometimes just make plain bacon and eggs, and they'll eat it a little begrudgingly, but they'll eat it. And then I will often a couple times a week make crepes. And I will just take 9 eggs and 1 cup of flour, like actual, just normal flour, and blend
normal
that.
Flour?
Yeah, I know.
Nut-based flour, or
no, because I can't make the crepe very well with that, and I don't want to. So someone would probably say, "Oh gosh, Ben, you're such a hypocrite." I'm not, because I'm confessing. But I found that to make crepes, you have to have the stickiness of wheat flour. Otherwise, it just crumbles into nothing, and the kids are trying to eat it, and it's crumbling out of their mouth. So I'll make those crepes so that every individual crepe I make has 1 egg in it, and then we'll put cream, we'll put berries, like just whip up some cream and some berries. And yes, I know they're each getting, like almost a tenth of a cup of flour, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't upset me even the slightest. And so that's like a crepe that we'll make a couple times a week. And then we'll make low carb waffles, which are pretty easy because the waffle maker just can kind of stick everything together really well, that you can't get away with crepes. But when I make waffles, we load it with butter, and then we have maple syrup. I don't eat these. Usually I'm either fasting through breakfast, just sipping on a cup of tea or something, or I will just make up my own little side of eggs. But for my little growing kids, they will put syrup, actual old-fashioned original maple syrup on their waffles, and I don't care a bit. It doesn't upset me at all. I look at this and think you're getting a lot of eggs, or it's cottage cheese in the waffles, or it's whatever, and I think you're getting some great sources of protein and the natural fats that come with it, and I'm okay with that. Lunch is more of a kind of typical lunch in some instances, depending on what they decide they want that day, including a peanut butter sandwich. I'm okay if they have that. And then dinner is typically meat and vegetables. That's commonly, like today we're having, it's my little Asher, my little 8-year-old, is responsible for dinner, and he wanted meatballs and like zucchini noodles or something. So that's what we're going to have. And that works for me.
I love it. I love it. And just shows you just that you don't have to be, I think we get so caught up in being perfect and having to have it perfect. And, there's no such thing. And I'll be the first to say it. We do the best we can. And my kids go to school with a wrap, it'll have some, maybe some chicken, some processed lunch meat in it or something. But yeah, the ones that, certainly now I've got a 19-year-old, my oldest. I mean, I just see once they're over a certain age, there's very little control you have over what they eat. But at home, that's always been my thing. I do control what comes in, and I kind of say to them, whatever's in the house, you help yourself too. But I certainly don't buy, too much processed stuff. I do buy them stuff like I let them have popcorn. I let them have some plain crisps, because the plain ones, they don't have the sugar. To me, that's fine, and that's all part of a normal childhood, But I think
I feel the same way. I feel the same way. I never want my kids, to be honest, there's very much a part of me worried on occasion, and I try to balance this because I think, are my kids going to get out of my house someday and then just go bonkers?
They're nuts.
Because they will say, I never could have sugar. I never could have, what are these things? These are called potato chips, or, oh my goodness, they're the best thing I've ever had. And then they kill themselves on a potato chip overdose. I just never wanted to have my kids feel like they were deprived. And so we very much talk about it. And I'll say, all right, hey, let's eat this meat. Oh man, meat is so good for you. And I joke with my little boy. They'll say, look at daddy's, that looks like an egg, because I'm eating eggs. And so I'm getting my big arms. I'm getting strong. So I want them to have a good relationship with food. But I also want I just want it to be real food. I want them to know that food is yummy. There can be treats, but those are treats and we put them in their place and they're not the basis of our diet. The basis of our diet is protein and fat from natural sources. And these little treats are things that are just sort of sprinkled throughout the week.
Yeah. Just one more quick question on that. And it may be your wife that might have to answer it. But, as mums too, a lot of people get very anxious about parties or gatherings and things like that, in terms of management of what their kids eat. Do you have a sort of a philosophy around that? Do you kind of just let your kids go for it, or do you try and have some restriction around managing those?
Yeah. So our philosophy, it's very well, very deliberate and very cautiously, we came to this conclusion, which is it's a party, so let them just have a bloody good time. So no, basically we will usually have like cookies or cupcakes, but we always will have other options as well. I just never wanted to be that kind of parent, where it's like the kids come and they want to have cake and, oh, we don't have cake, you can have some carrot sticks. I never wanted to be that kind of guy.
Because no one had come back.
even at Halloween, even Tracey, full disclosure, even at Halloween, Cheryl has told me in the past, she said, man, Ben, you know too much. Maybe we shouldn't hand out candy. I'm saying, no, I'm not I just can't bring myself to do it, Tracey. There's my confession. My name is Ben. Forgive me, Tracey, for I have sinned. I give the little kids candy because I love seeing little kids in costumes, I don't want to deprive my kids. It's such a fun kind of one day a year, go around and get candy. Now in my own home, what we do when the kids come home, we do try to incentivize the kids to not want to eat it all. So they'll come home, they've been snacking on their candies and I don't begrudge them that one bit. I'm happy to let them have those treats. But as the evening sort of progresses and they're getting tired of their candy, which little kids do a little better than adults, then we will intervene. And I will say, oh, you're getting a little tired of your candy. Well, the more candy you leave outside on the doorstep, the more little gifts that the Great Pumpkin will leave. And so the Great Pumpkin, of course, is reflective of the early Charlie Brown and Snoopy cartoons, where they're waiting for this Great Pumpkin to come, almost like a Santa Claus type figure. And so the kids will take their candy bag. Now it's a joke, of course. They know it's silly. And they always did. They will leave their candy bags on the doorstep. Cheryl and I will take them and throw them out. And we will just leave a bunch of little kind of dollar store, little just toys and things for them, or like a video game, or something, just to try to incentivize the kids to not want to eat it all, to just try to check that behavior, because otherwise that Halloween candy is just the gift that keeps giving for the next 2 weeks. They're picking on it and hoarding it in their rooms and eating it all night. So we just want to try to get that out, literally out of the house.
What a great idea. I used to do something similar, not Halloween, because it was not really, some people celebrate it here, but it's never been something that, my family's done. But after parties and things like that, when the kids had come home with a whole bag of lollies and stuff like that, I just sort of said, well, look, you can have a few, it's up to you, or you can give it to mum and mum's going to put some money in your bank account. And then you can go and buy the book club like they'd buy, I don't know if they have it over there, but the kids come home with a little magazine that they love going through with books and little toys, and they choose then what they want to buy. And for my older kids and now for my 8-year-old, that's starting to work. It worked really, really well. And, for them, it was a choice that they made. And I never kind of said, you can't have any of it. But, this could be a better option. And they loved doing that. So there's always little things we can do. But yeah, I love how you've shared that. I think you've made so many people feel okay for doing the best they can.
Well, I certainly try to feel good about doing the best I can. So if I can help someone else feel good, then good. I've done my job.
Oh, awesome. And I'm really conscious of the time. Do you have time for one more question?
Of course. Yeah, please. Let's do it.
Thank you. Because I wanted to ask you, we've talked about the kids. Now, what about you? And do you and your wife, this may be too personal, please feel free not to answer, but do you kind of eat the same, have the same philosophy? And in that, can you please answer for me your view on intermittent fasting? Because there just seems to be, a lot of different information out there. And, I personally think people have to work out for them what works for them. But, can you get metabolically healthy without intermittent fasting and just focusing on the food?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
So I think there's kind of two there. So what do Cheryl and I do? And how might we differ or align? And then two, thoughts on intermittent fasting. So with regards to me and Cheryl, we do very much view nutrition the same way. She very much believes what I say, but she didn't at first. It was a bit of an evolution for her, mind you, just like it was for me. The idea that a low carbohydrate diet is what I believe to be superior for metabolic health, that is not something I just came to. I was as steeped in the old idea that low fat is best as much as anyone was, if not more so, because of even my master's degree. And that was from that point on, after my master's degree in exercise physiology, which was very much just, it's all about calorie number, and fat is bad, and saturated fat is like the 9th level of hell. I had to unlearn that. And as I was going through that process of just relying on nothing but the data, I would share these things with Cheryl, and she did not just buy into it as a testament to just her strength of character. She is in no way swept over or convinced by things I just say or do. In fact, if anything, the old maxim that you're never a prophet in your own country, well, you're never an expert in your own home. Because with me, Cheryl would just say, Ben, I don't really know. And then she saw how healthy I was and how kind of effortless it was for me to be lean. And after our last baby, our third, she was having a bit of a time losing weight and thought, I'm just it was just slower than the other two. She just tried low carb and it just started happening. So that helped. So that we very much are aligned in that regard, kind of following these 3 principles of control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. The difference between the two of us is that Cheryl is a moderator. I am an abstainer. And that's this idea that I didn't come up with that. I heard someone else say it at some point, and I don't know where they got it from, but I just loved it. So I've kind of stolen it, but it wasn't my idea originally. But it really resonated with me. For example, if Cheryl and I each have a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, we each had our favorite flavor. Cheryl can open that pint, daintily take a few bites, put the lid back on, and put it back in the freezer and be done with it. I can't do that. The moment that lid comes off, it's not going back on. I will eat the whole pint. It's just, I just can't. And I'm watching her putting the lid back on, and I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? How are you stopping eating that? I found that I'm stronger if I never even start. Whatever the treat is, whatever the indulgence is, I can look at it and say no far more easily than I can say I'm done. Typically, me saying I'm done is when I've gotten so uncomfortably full on whatever it is that I just look back and think, what on earth did I just do? Why did I eat that much? I didn't want to eat that much. Cheryl never does that. So she can indulge in sweets and treats a little more than I can, because it's just better for me never even to start. We just are very different in that regard. She is a moderator. She can moderate her consumption. I am an abstainer. It's better if I never even start. And I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas who said something like, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. For me, that's true. For Cheryl, it's not. She can moderate her consumption very, very well. I can't. I just have more of that kind of overindulgent sort of tendency. Now, with regards to fasting, that's also very much something where Cheryl and I disagree, because she can't fast at all. She hates it. She would rather do almost anything in life than fast for even 24 hours. It is. She's miserable. She hates every minute of it and just refuses to do it outright. I don't mind it a bit. I find fasting to be quite simple, and I do it quite often. Often I hear people doing like 72-hour fasts. I once tried to do a 48-hour fast and hated it. I got to about 36 hours and just thought, I'm not enjoying this at all. I'm just going to go eat. This is silly. But a 24-hour fast I find very easy. And I typically will do one 24-hour fast per week. And then a few other times a week. It's not really strategic. I wouldn't want someone to think that I have like a written down plan. It'll just really depend on how I feel that morning and how hard my workout was the day before. Whether I kind of do intermittent fasting, like an 18-6 or a 1 meal a day, it just kind of depends on me, how I feel in the day I'm having. But one thing I will say about intermittent fasting, where I worry a lot of people go wrong, it is better. There's the human study supports this idea, and I've seen these tendencies in myself, but it's hard to do. It is better to fast on the later half of the day than the front half. Now, it's harder to do that though. But if someone fasts through dinner, they will be better than fasting through breakfast. There was a study, I wish I could cite it specifically, that looked at this idea of early versus late fasting, and the late fasting was better. And I think it is because evening is time of indulgence, the witching hour when it comes to cravings. And so if you just have eaten lunch and you're just done, you get through that worst of all the day better. Because it's very rare that someone really goes off the rails and indulges for breakfast. It just doesn't really happen. Not to say they won't have an unhealthy breakfast. They certainly could. But very few people are just gorging themselves on junk food for breakfast. And so I have actually found I control my appetite better in the evening if I have a hearty breakfast. It is, I don't know that I've experienced an exception to this. If I will have a hearty breakfast, I can control my evening cravings better. Now, that's not to say I don't sometimes fast through breakfast. I do, but almost every time I will have to work harder to control my evening cravings than when I eat a big breakfast. And so there's some other old delightful adage, which is something like breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And so this idea of you kind of stack your food to be bigger in the day, at the front end of the day rather, and it sort of tapers off. For me, that holds true. It is much easier to control my appetite in the evening, which is when I'm at my worst, if I've had a bigger breakfast.
That's fantastic. And, I think I've seen that myself as well. I certainly find myself getting cravings even now. I get asked all the time, when am I going to stop getting cravings? I'm like, well, I don't know, because because I still get them, and sometimes I'll indulge and sometimes I won't. I think, it's just our relationship we have to them. I think it's just a normal part of human nature, really, to get them. But that's very interesting. The other thing I wanted to say, I am like you. If it's there and it's opened, particularly around, some sort of keto white chocolate, I'll probably eat the whole block of it. But I just want people to know who you are. I love how you say that. It's not a personality flaw. It is what it is. So many times we think if that's us, then there's something wrong with us. And, we can certainly see a whole lot of things around it and manage it better, but it's definitely not a personality flaw. If Ben Bikman is like that too.
Yeah. If wrinkled, bald Ben, who's the paragon of perfectness, no, not at all. But I do think it's important not to judge ourselves too harshly, but just be mindful of the fact that for me, if it comes in the home, it will take a Herculean effort for me not to eat it. I'm strongest, and I just never open that. If it's a bag of chips or crisps, I can't open it. I just have to do my best to ignore it. Cheryl can take him down and eat a handful. I can't do it.
That's fascinating. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time again today. What a fantastic conversation. I'm so honored. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure, Tracey. My pleasure. We covered a lot of topics, and as usual, I gave long, very quickly worded answers, but hopefully some of this was helpful.
Absolutely. I think it was very, very helpful. Just can't thank you enough. Thank you.